Hello. Yep, so I'm Elaine from CAT, the Coalition to Abolish Animal Testing, and as you could tell by our name, we're for the abolition of animal research. And our main campaign is called No Cures in 45 Years, and that has to do with the fact that the Oregon Primate Research Center has been open since 1962, and we don't believe it's contributed anything to human health. So our focus is the argument that it's not useful. So I'll talk, pretty briefly about what that argument is, and also try to make a case for why we should all really know those arguments, why whatever the reason it is that you get involved in this issue or whatever compels you to care about it, that we really, really need to understand the medical and scientific arguments about this issue. And I believe it's so important because most people think that animal research is a necessary evil. And most people are never going to oppose animal research if they think it's going to cure cancer, if they think it's going to cure Alzheimer's and help people save sick children and all that. But the reality is that it's never going to cure cancer. It hasn't contributed anything to treatment of cancer, and it's just not working. And so to not use that argument, I think, is a waste. And also, if you have an opponent and you want to shut something down, in this case, I think we should shut down all animal research, but we're talking specifically about OHSU's Primate Center. You need to know what their arguments are. You need to know what they're claiming and how to refute that. So does anyone know what is it that the Primate Center claims they've contributed? Does anyone know?
Medical research.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Matt?
If you talk to their PR people, they have had advances in every field. They have found a new formula for breast milk, and they've found out that vitamin C is so important to for women who are smoking pregnancy, and Alzheimer's research, and you name it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So especially if you're going to campaign against OHSU's Primate Center, I would look at their website and I would look at what it is they're claiming they've done. And those are some really good examples. And I want to talk a little bit about a few of those and why their claims are bogus. Animal researchers and animal research proponents will take credit for everything, every advance that's ever happened to humanity. But specifically, the Primate Center does say that they've figured out what needs to be in formula, in infant formula. So specifically Martha Nuringer, who's a researcher out there, as far as I know, has been doing the same kind of infant nutrition studies with minor variations for, what would you say, Matt, like decades or?
Yeah. Decades
anyway, roughly. So the thing that is causing them to say they've helped figure out what needs to be in infant formula is that she studied certain fatty acids that are in human milk. And by removing those fatty acids from formula, seeing how that affected baby monkeys. And lo and behold, it affected them badly. So as if, let's just, for the sake of argument, pretend we need to figure out what infants need, because we could look at breast milk, but let's just put that aside for a second. This was proving something. If in this case it looks like baby monkeys and baby humans need the same thing in this case, so say that showed that, it's the same thing that was already showed by many clinical studies. So this is the way they work, is they demonstrate something in monkeys that we already know from humans or could have easily shown in humans, and then they take credit for the advance and the fact that now these fatty acids are in formula. So that's how that particular claim works. Yeah, one that, some of their research kind of on face value sounds stupid, and I think anyone who with some common sense can tell, like the Judy Cameron stuff, that it's just bogus, like we're not going to learn about depression. But some of it sounds a little more altruistic. For example, they're trying to find an AIDS vaccine, and they say that the only way that we can ever find an AIDS vaccine is with the rhesus macaque model. This has no basis in fact, it's just a claim. And actually there's been now 50 vaccines against HIV that have worked in monkeys, and none of them have worked in people. So that's just an example of the, look at the language they use and be very careful about what you're reading. Because even with the AIDS vaccine, they're talking about we're developing a model. So there's not very much claim, even claiming that they've accomplished something that actually is being used in humans, but the baby formula is one, because yes, those fatty acids are in baby formula. So moving on, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the basics of why animal research is a bad idea from a scientific and medical viewpoint, why it doesn't work. Of course, the main argument is that we need to use animals to model humans so that we can cure disease, so we can screen new drugs and procedures and products of all kinds to keep us safe. The reality is that's not working, and animal research is actually doing a lot more harm than good. The problem is that one species can't really model for another. Each species is unique. You can give the same substance to different strains of rats and you can get a different result. So to extrapolate from even a monkey to a human, it doesn't really work. So even humans and chimps, for example, which fortunately I think are less being used for medical research, they share most of our DNA. We're very, very similar. But similar isn't really good enough, especially at the level at which we're now studying disease. And one example of how chimps, our closest relatives, are different from us is how they respond to PCP. So now we all know what happens when a person takes PCP, right? What happens? Psychosis, they freak out. In a chimp, it's a sedative. This is one example. And even if we have gross similarities, like there's a lot that different species have in common, at the cellular level, we are different, and that's where we're studying disease. The technology we have now is so advanced, and we're studying it at such an idiosyncratic level that this use of other animals is just so barbaric and nonsensical. Can't even think of any other differences in how different species react to different things, like a medicine or a food or anything.
Penicillin.
Yep. Yeah, penicillin saves a lot of lives, kills guinea pigs, kills a certain kind of hamster. Now I'll talk a little more about penicillin because that's an interesting story that kind of illustrates how this whole thing works. Yeah, penicillin, a lot of stuff that we take every day is very dangerous in other species, like aspirin. It causes birth defects in other animals. All sorts of things. There's a lot of examples. Morphine is a stimulant to certain animals that are used in laboratory tests. Yeah, and like I said, different strains of the same animal react differently. Thalidomide, which is one of the more famous cases of the failure of animal research, where thalidomide was prescribed mostly in the 50s as a sedative. It was tested. There's a lot of argument about how this all happened, but what it seems is that it was tested on animals before it went to market. It was safe, and then it caused thousands and thousands of babies to be born with very severe birth defects, either missing or very stunted limbs. And then what they did is they went back and tried to repeat this in animals to see, I don't know, to prove that this was really happening, even though the evidence with humans was really piling up and they knew what was going on. But in some rabbits, they couldn't, most of the animals, they couldn't reproduce this effect. It didn't cause any harm to dozens of species. But there was one strain of rabbit that did develop what's called phocomelia, that particular deformity from this. So that shows you how even small difference between animals can make a big difference in how something manifests. There's less than a 50% chance that the reaction you get in a non-human animal is going to be the same in a human. So it's actually worse than tossing a coin. So the whole premise is that we can model something in another species, but the reality is that other animals don't get the same diseases that we do. Sometimes they do. Sometimes you can get a disease that's called the same thing and has a lot of similarities, but it manifests differently. And actually, I'm going to mention a couple times again the Dr. Breek book that they're selling, because everyone should read that. But he talks about how he got involved, he and his wife who co-wrote the book, how they got involved in this issue. And I don't think he gets as specific in the book, but I've heard him speak about it. And he says that his wife, who is a veterinarian, was in veterinary school, and I believe he was in medical school at the time. And they would get in these arguments about their patients because they were getting very different information. So I think what happened is Jean Greek came home from school and she had a patient, a dog, who had a certain kind of cancer. And he said, oh, that's terrible. That is absolutely fatal. There's no treatment and that dog's going to die pretty fast. So she went back to school with this information. They were like, no, it's like pretty harmless. You just ignore it in a dog. So that was kind of the beginning for them of like, well then, why are we modeling human disease with dogs and rats and monkeys and whatnot? So the bottom line is it doesn't predict human response, and that's the whole premise. That's why we think drugs have to be tested on them before people take them, products, you name it, procedures, surgery. But it's not predictive, therefore, as Dr. Greek says, it's not scientific. You have a question?
Is that required in the United States, or are there other countries that is not required?
There are other countries where that's not required. I'm not sure which countries besides here it is required. And interestingly, that when it was first legislated that we had to test everything on animals, it was after the thalidomide disaster, so it's pretty ironic.
So it could be a cultural thing, too.
It is definitely a cultural thing. I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons why it continues, despite the evidence, but certainly cultural, yeah, absolutely. 100,000 people a year die from taking prescription drugs as prescribed. That's more than all illegal drugs combined. I think that's a really important figure for when you're talking to people who are like, but what would we do, if we didn't test on animals? How would we know drugs were safe? They're not safe. We only know what they're going to do in people when people take them. So this lack of predictability gives you what we can call false positive and false negative results. So the false negative results are that the substance that they tried on whatever animal or animals didn't do anything, didn't work. So therefore you have the possibility of all kinds of things that could have been helpful in people never going to actual use in humans because it didn't work in the animal model. And that was what happened with penicillin almost. The way penicillin came about was pretty much serendipitous. It was accidentally seen that this penicillin killed bacteria in a petri dish. Alexander Fleming decided to try it on a rabbit who had an infection. And because rabbits process penicillin too fast to actually make use of it, they just excrete it, it didn't do any good. So he put it aside. So that's an example of how it was sidetracked. Fortunately, in this case, he ended up eventually using it. He had a patient who was dying and from an infection, and just sort of a last-ditch effort, he's like, oh, I'll try this penicillin, and it cured him. So even though animal researchers like to take credit for the entire field of antibiotics, that's actually where it came from. And like I said before, penicillin kills guinea pigs, so if he tried it on a guinea pig, who knows? Protease inhibitors, do y'all know what protease inhibitors are? It's what they're giving to people with HIV to prevent it from turning into AIDS. And certainly there's a lot of different beliefs about that, but the general belief is that it saved, thousands, possibly millions of lives. So what happened with protease inhibitors is it was very promising in the development stage, and the development of drugs doesn't come from the animal lab. It goes through the animal trials after development. So that's kind of a common misunderstanding, that it just springs out of the rat studies. It springs out of in vitro work and computer modeling, chemistry, which is incredibly advanced now. So anyway, protease inhibitors were promising in the development stage. Merck, who was the first to manufacture and distribute them when they eventually did go to market, tested on dogs, and it killed the dogs. So they put it aside for 4 years, and this was at the height of the AIDS epidemic, so how many people could have been saved in 4 years? Eventually, because of the circumstances and it was so promising, they went ahead to clinical trials anyway, and it was very effective. So it's the same with the delay thing happens a lot. The recall of thalidomide was delayed. Like I said, after they started seeing in humans these deformities, the scientists scrambled to the lab to try to reproduce this in all different kinds of animals, and they couldn't. And even though this evidence existed that it was very harmful to humans, they didn't recall it for years because they couldn't reproduce this in the lab. It's kind of the same thing with one of the biggest scandals of all time, which is tobacco. And that's how the tobacco companies didn't have any liability for their product for decades, because you can't give cancer to laboratory animals from cigarette smoke. Yeah, actually, and I think there's this great story about how in '93, I think a tobacco executive was testifying before Congress and still saying it's not proven that cigarettes give you cancer because we can't prove it in the lab. So it's a great alibi. So those are just some of the many, many, many deadly consequences we've had from reliance on animal testing. Hormone replacement therapy is a big scandal that's very entrenched, I think, with animal research. Hormone replacement therapy was pretty much a giant experiment on women. The monkey data that they used to get this thing to market and to clinical trials was that it actually protected, it actually had some cardiovascular benefits for the women who took it. But it was discovered a couple years into this that it actually increases the risk of heart attack and stroke in women taking hormone replacement therapy, exactly the opposite of the monkey data. So in the meantime, women were being experimented on and dying. Vioxx is a really recent scandal. I don't know if you heard about Vioxx. Yeah, that was safe in lab animals, and it's killed tens of thousands of people. There's been something like 140,000 incidents of heart attack and stroke. Tens of thousands of people have died, and more people will continue to die because they now have congestive heart failure. None of this showed up in the animals. Same thing with surgery. A lot of surgery techniques were first tried out on animals, and first time they use it in people die because people and animals are different. Radial keratotomy, which is the eye surgery that they did eventually get right and they now use in people successfully, but they tried it out on rabbits. They sort of learned it on rabbits, and then the first people that got the surgery went blind because we have different corneas than rabbits. They can regenerate in a way we can't. Same thing with pretty much all transplants. They killed the first patients because of things that were unforeseen in the animal model. I want to read you a quote. There's actually, the more you learn about this, the more shocking it is, because there is so much admission in the literature of the animal researchers that this fails, but they'll still defend the practice. So I want to read you this quote from the Handbook of Laboratory Animal Science, so sort of the Bible of the vivisector. Quote, "It is impossible to give reliable general rules for the validity of extrapolation from one species to another. This can often only be verified after the first trials in the target species, meaning humans. Extrapolation from animal models will always remain a matter of hindsight." So they're admitting that we don't know how a human is going to react to something until we have the human data. They're admitting that, as they do over and over again, but they'll never question the practice beyond that. One of the main arguments for animal research, which is getting more and more silly as our technology gets better, and now we've mapped the human genome, we can have an entire genome on a chip. I mean, it's so advanced, it's hard to even get your head around what they can do now to study humans. But one of the arguments they like to use is that, well, we have to use an intact system. We have to use a whole animal to see how something works. And so when we make the argument about using in vitro methods, meaning in a test tube, human cells and human parts, so to speak, that's not good enough because we need a whole system. Well, first of all, you have the problem that if you have a whole intact system, it's still the system of a rat or a chimp, and it still doesn't tell you anything about the human. And I actually have a really good quote about that argument, the whole system argument. There's, in the handout that you got when you came, hopefully you got it, there's a pretty long frequently asked questions, which is really excellent. It's from Americans for Medical Advancement, which is Dr. Greek's organization. But his answer to that is a little lengthy in there, and it's good, but I'm going to read you another one. This was written by Rick Bogle. He did this great debunking of one of the websites or the website for one of the regional primate research centers. And I'm just going to read it to you. Yeah, he's Rick Bogle of the Primate Freedom Project. So here's the claim as it is on their website, and like I said, another one of the National Primate Research Centers. Many research questions can only be answered through detailed study of a whole living system. Disease processes are complex, involving multiple physiological processes and multiple organ systems. And then the response. It is this complexity that makes the idea of whole living systems as testbeds so problematic. The difference between a chimpanzee and a human are poorly understood. Chimpanzees are the nearest genetic relatives to humans. This should make them the best models for human disease and physiology. But the differences in disease progression, the interaction between the host and disease organisms, are profound and not well understood. So that's a little more concisely said than it is in the frequently asked questions, but Dr. Reek's answer is very good also. So one thing that's in that frequently asked questions is the question about alternatives, and that's a question you'll get a lot if you're involved in this issue. I personally never answer the question about, well, what are the alternatives to animal research without qualifying the term alternative, because I think use of alternative implies that animal research is valuable and valid. So I never answer that with saying, well, if we dispensed with it entirely, we would be better off. But these are some of the research methodologies that are effective. And so some of them are listed in there. The main ones, like I said, where drug discovery comes from anyway, is computer modeling, which includes very advanced chemistry and math, and in vitro studies. And then there's a whole lot of other ways that we've learned about human health, human-based research. Actually, Dr. Greek wrote a third book that I would recommend, although if you're going to read one book, read Sacred Cows and Golden Geese. But he wrote a book called What Will We Do If We Don't Experiment on Animals? Because, of course, that's the question you will get every time. And we interviewed him a few years ago, and when we had him off camera, we were talking to him about this book. He was touring with this new book, and it really is just a list, pretty much, of where medical breakthroughs have come from, all of the non-animal research methods that have led to actual breakthroughs. And so we were talking to him about the book, and he said, and he was asking what we thought of it because I'd read it, and he said, you know, honestly, I really didn't want to write this book. It seemed really stupid. It's like I wrote these two books. They're thoroughly researched and cited, and I made this great case of why animal research doesn't work. And then I had to write this third book. He said, it's as if I wrote two books, and I lectured and I toured about why. I wrote one book, and it was how you shouldn't eat rocks. They're bad for you. And then I wrote another book more about the ways that eating rocks will actually kill you eventually. And then I had to write a third book called What Do We Do If We Don't Eat Rocks? So that's what I think about when people ask, what are the alternatives? Like, what are the alternatives to dangerous, misleading, useless research? But it does help to familiarize yourself with some non-animal methods, just so you have some idea of where the discoveries come from. But one thing that's challenging about using this argument, or just talking about animal research in general, is that, of course, like I said before, animal researchers like to take credit for everything. And there's just so many claims that they make and that people believe, and that I used to believe. So what I say about that is, well, first of all, anyone can claim anything they want to. That's the main thing. Claiming something doesn't mean it's true. But I want to talk a little bit about one of the main ways that they get away with these lies and why we believe them. They're very good at confusing what Dr. Greek refers to as causal versus casual relationships. So yes, there's been a lot of medical breakthroughs, and yes, there's been a lot of animal research, but the question is that a causal relationship? And they really, really like to confuse that, just like with the baby formula thing. Yes, there were studies on monkeys that showed that these ingredients should be in baby formula, and yes, we started adding them. That wasn't a causal relationship, that's a casual relationship. The story of the polio vaccine is a really good example of that. And it's interesting how often people will bring up the polio vaccine, as if, something that was discovered decades and decades ago is like the only thing they can think of to defend current animal research. But nevertheless, it does come up a lot. And I'm going to read you something that's actually, I think it's in your frequently asked questions, because it really illustrates, unless it's going to take too long. How are we doing on time? What time is it? Okay, so I'm just going to read this, because I think this really illustrates how the causal-casual thing gets confused in our minds. So this is the frequently asked question that he's discussing. Didn't the polio vaccine come from animal experimentation? Animal experimentation actually delayed this much-needed vaccine throughout the first half of the 20th century. When polio first appeared around 1835, it rapidly paralyzed and killed its victims. In 1908, a virus was suspected, and scientists began working on a vaccine. Note, in developing a vaccine, it's crucial to determine how the infection enters the body. Luckily, pathologists discovered the polio virus in human intestines as early as 1912, suggesting entrance through the digestive tract. So this is where they first discovered the most important thing was from human autopsy. Meanwhile, researchers successfully infected monkeys with polio. But because monkeys contract polio nasally rather than orally, this triumph only postponed the development of an effective vaccine for decades. Incredibly, the scientists working on the vaccine chose to ignore the human digestive data in favor of the monkey data. Just like other examples I've already given about, well, we like the data that we see from the monkeys and it's more convenient, our suits our sales of our products, so we're going to go with that. That's what happened with Vioxx. It is true that a vaccine was derived from animal experimentation, but manufactured from monkey tissue, this cure resulted in 6 human deaths and 12 cases of paralysis. It was abandoned. Further, animal experimentation led to the development of a nasal treatment which only caused permanent olfactory damage to the children tested, meaning a bunch of kids lost their sense of smell because they sprayed chemicals in the kid's nose because the monkeys got it through their nose. In 1941, Dr. Albert Sabin studied human autopsies to finally disprove the nasal theory. He found the virus confined to the gastrointestinal tract has been documented nearly 30 years earlier. Okay, so this is a quote from Sabin denouncing the monkey model. Prevention was long delayed by the erroneous conception of the nature of the human disease based on misleading experimental models of the disease in monkeys. Finally, in 1949, Nobel Prize winner John Enders paved the way for a vaccine by growing the virus in tissue cultures. Though the vaccine could have been produced from human tissue, convention prevailed and manufacturers opted to use monkey tissue instead. Containing the live virus, the animal-based vaccine infected 204 people with polio and resulted in 11 documented deaths. It also resulted in at least one virus, SV40, jumping the species barrier and infecting humans. Because of that, the polio vaccine is now grown in human diploid cell culture rather than animal tissue. And this is controversial, but there's those that believe that SV40 is still causing brain cancer in people now around the world. So that's a whole other problem with animal research that I don't really think I'll get into about transmitting viruses. But anyway, polio is such an old story, but I use that to just illustrate how it gets in people's head that we wouldn't have had this vaccine without animal research, because animal research existed and it was so intertwined in what happened. But as often happens, it really ended up killing people and delaying an effective vaccine. And back to Rick Bogle. He has the best analogy for this, so I'm going to read you that part of his debunking. Okay, so back to the, this is actually the Southwest Foundation for Biomedical Research's website and their claims. During the 20th century, virtually every major advance in medical knowledge and treatment involved research using animals. 2/3 of Nobel Prizes in medicine awarded since 1901 were won for discoveries that required the use of animals. So Rick comments, indeed, virtually every major advance in medical knowledge and treatment involved researchers drinking coffee or tea as well. It is as misleading to claim that the coffee and tea were needed for medical progress as it is to imply that animal models were needed and that no other method could have been successful. So it's a great analogy, although frankly I think coffee and tea is probably much more useful to science than animal research. So I know that using the scientific and medical arguments can be very intimidating. because it's scientific. I'm not a scientist. I don't pretend to be. And it is complicated, and we do need to educate ourselves. But at the same time, I would like to encourage people to not be intimidated by it. For one, because you can appeal to people's common sense. Most people do believe animal research is necessary, but at the same time, they wouldn't take their child to the vet. They wouldn't take their dog to the pediatrician. They wouldn't give their dog chocolate. I mean, we common sense, we know these things. And so to get people to start thinking, relating their common sense knowledge to this issue. So like I said, I don't want to discourage people from educating themselves more about the science part, obviously, but to also just realize most people do have an opinion about it, and most people aren't scientists, and most people don't know very much about this issue, and you can. It's also helpful to remember that it's not just, you know, me or animal rights people or whatever with this opinion. There's thousands of doctors and scientists, and this opinion is really growing around the world. And there's a lot of evidence to that. There's organizations made up entirely of doctors who oppose animal research because it doesn't work, it harms their patients. That would include Americans for Medical Advancement, Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, etc. And most of the questions you're going to get are going to be the same over and over again. And if you have a basic understanding of the arguments, you're going to be able to handle most challenges. Because like I said, most people have a very shallow understanding of this. They believe in it because they've heard it a lot. It's simply repetition. It's not because they've examined any evidence. And I also think it's helpful if you really are going to get involved in this and you're going to do outreach, is to prepare yourself for the fact that you won't necessarily be able to answer all questions, and that's okay. And it's, we don't need to pretend we know everything. Nobody does. So besides the fact that almost all the questions are, well, what will we do if we don't eat rocks and the like? It's okay to say, I don't know the history of that particular thing, but I do know that a lot of the claims I've heard have been false, and I know that, et cetera, especially if you have some knowledge of where this information is, that there are a lot of doctors and scientists, that you can refer people to books, you can have some basis for your own opinion. It's very helpful, and it's a good way to feel okay if you can't answer a particular question about, say, if the very rare occasion someone comes up with some obscure challenge. And also, I don't think I've yet encountered anyone who came up to me angry that I was protesting OHSU and being able to name a single thing that they could say the Primate Center has contributed. So, people don't really know very much about this. So yeah, I would, that being said, I would encourage people, please read Dr. Reek's book. It's a great opportunity to get it at cost. You can also get it out of the library. In the packet that you got handed out, there's a list of other books. That's the one I most recommend, and websites that you can look at. And you can certainly always contact CAT, my organization, if you're looking for anything in particular. And I did make up some additional practice questions because I wasn't sure how long we would have. And I can give those to people if they want. And it's based on things that I've come across over the years. And I'll go over a couple of them right now. Has anyone ever gotten this question? Well, I would rather they experimented on animals than on people. Yeah. So how would anyone answer that? Anyone have any good ideas how to answer that one? Yeah?
They already do. I mean, just in a different way than you expect.
Yeah, exactly. That's how I would usually start out that question. That we already do. Kind of like I was saying with hormone replacement therapy, that's just one of, it's every drug, every single drug that is tried by people. They're the guinea pig, so to speak. Did you have anything else to add to that, Matt? You raised your hand? Okay. What would you say?
I think what we need is a dialogue rather than just an answer. I once made a statement as to an acquaintance, all animal experiments are bad, none of them are needed. And they came over very much like, I just can't agree with that, So I stepped back and I said, well, let me put it this way. I think 99% are not needed, and 1% is questionable. And he says, oh, I can agree with that, which was a perfect opening to get a dialogue going.
Interesting.
And instead of creating a polarity, I was able to get into their point of view, and then and kind of help him explore his thought a little bit more.
That's a great point. Because, like I said, most people haven't come to their opinion based on really looking at any evidence. It's just we've heard it so much. So that's dialogue is awesome. Anyone else have anything to add to that? Okay. Another one is, well, I already sort of talked about that. What about all the medical breakthroughs that have come from animal research? Just because you've heard something doesn't make it true. Investigation into those claims shows them to be false. And back to the causal thing, just because animal research has occurred and a medical breakthrough has occurred, there's not necessarily a causal relationship. I'm just going to do one other from my list, and that is, well, what about Gleevec? Does anyone know what Gleevec is? Matt does? That's an important thing to know because, like I said, if you're going to oppose someone, you want to know what their claims are and what they're bragging about. Gleevec is what appears to be a huge breakthrough drug that has come out of OHSU. Now, OHSU does a lot of things. They do clinical research, they do in vitro research, some of which I'm sure is very valid. So it's important to remember that there's a difference between their vast animal research program and everything else that they do. So Gleevec appears to be possibly some sort of miraculous cure. It's had incredible success treating a certain type of leukemia, chronic myelogenous leukemia, and now it looks like they're starting to use it for some other cancers. So people will sometimes talk about Gleevec as a defense of the Primate Center, whereas it really has nothing to do with the Primate Center. It's a breakthrough of human genetic medicine, of our incredibly advanced understanding now of the human genome. It was developed using totally non-animal methods, including high throughput screening, which is huge right now. And it really owes nothing to animal experimentation, let alone the Primate Center. It probably was screened in animals after it was developed because that's the law and that's convention. So I think that's important to know what OHSU is claiming, even if it doesn't, it's not like OHSU is necessarily claiming this came from the Primate Center as far as I know. But in people's minds, that all gets jumbled up. So that's it. I'll stop there. And like I said, if anyone wants these extra practice questions, I'll put them out or something. But the frequently asked questions that is in the packet you got is really good, and I would recommend reading it a bunch of times and maybe like paraphrasing it back to yourself so you can see if you really understand it, because it's Dr. Greek and he's kind of wordy. So do we want to take questions together, Matt, or what do we want to do?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay. So, you have a plan, Chad?
If we didn't get the packet, we didn't make enough. Yeah, we have one extra one, but if you put your name on the load email list, we're going to make a PDF of it and send it out to people to put it on the website so people can download it and send it to people too.
Yeah.
When you said 100,000 people a year die of prescription or of legal drugs, is that in the U.S. alone? Or?
Yeah, that's just in the U.S., and that's from the Journal of the American Medical Association, that figure. It's pretty widely quoted. Yeah, and it's like 15% of hospital admissions. And that's used as prescribed. That's not like people abusing them and or taking them, overdosing intentionally or anything like that. It's just, it's because of the unpredicted consequences from the drug, from basing on animal data.
Is there anything being done on a legal level to stop the animal testing?
Do you want me to answer that? Or
Yeah, I'd have to kind of yes and no.
There's a bill right now called the Great Ape Protection Act, which will ban research on chimpanzees. And anyone who believes in the political system should definitely contact your representatives and encourage them, if they're not already supporting that, to do so. And I think that we will see very soon an end to research on chimpanzees. It's virtually ended already. We've had some chimpanzees go to sanctuaries, and this bill will seal it and will take the remaining, 12 or 1,500 chimpanzees that are lingering in labs. Another thing that's happening on the legal front, In Defense of Animals has launched a petition to the FDA to make alternatives mandatory. So, in other words, if you know, what's happening currently in the U.S. is that we are way behind countries like European countries who have lots of, you know, and I hate to even use the word alternative for the same reason. That's yeah, alternatives. But there are many better techniques that are already being implemented that are making a lot of animal research completely, you know, archaic. Things that are implemented in European countries that are not implemented here, and so, and also, you know, research that's happening here that's stuck in these animal models where we could be using others. So this FDA petition would make all alternatives that are available and safe, instead of making them recommended, make them mandatory, and that same petition could be, you know, broadened to, you know, larger groups of agencies outside of just the FDA. Trying to think of what else. Can you think of anything else legally that's going on right now?
Do you guys have an indication on IDA and CAT and I don't know about computers here, but like their goals in this campaign in the near future, if they're going to change or step up any, or
in the local campaigns here?
The Primate Research Center.
Well, there's been some discussion just recently between In Defense of Animals and PETA on some ideas that could happen that are not really, I'm not really prepared to talk about in public yet, but I would say yes. There's definitely some things that are at least being discussed, and certainly we would look at whatever's happening in the grassroots community too. If there was a lot of motivation in this direction, we would definitely steer more energy towards this campaign too.
So as far as CAT, you mean is our role going to change or step up? Is that what you're asking? It really depends on the volunteers. I mean, CAT is not an organization like PETA or IDA. It has no staff. It's a network of volunteers. Our main focus has been education, and this, like I said, this particular, you know, it doesn't work, and you're being scammed in the white coat welfare aspect of it. So the plan, as far as, you know, I can say, is to continue on with that work and the door hanging and all that, but, you know, none of that is enough, and so our role could step up if we have the people to do it. So it's very based on people's willingness to get involved, because that's what it's all about. We don't, like I said, we don't have staff. So if people want to make it more active, that'd be awesome. But that's our main role, is education, you know, door hanging and visibility events, and sort of being at OHSU events and being annoying.
You know, for reasons that Elaine has already mentioned, it serves their interest to be able to find models to test their drugs safe on, and that makes our work that much harder, because so much of the major networks where people get their information on a, you know, massive scale are so controlled by who's advertising, and, you know, who's advertising more than pharmaceuticals, you know. So it's very tough to go up against them. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, it is pretty much all money. Like, I think it's the lie it's based on, and the fact that it's profitable, and it would certainly stop right away if there were no money involved. And even when the pharmaceutical industries get sued, you know, because drugs kill people, they still come out ahead, because, you know, by the time that happens, they've made so many billions of dollars that using that alibi of animal research actually still benefits them, even if they get sued. So, and of course, with the private, grant stuff, or the public stuff that's going on, like at OHSU. Yeah, it's the motivation is money, and they build the facility and then figure out what to do in it, as far as I can tell, or they see what's the latest thing that there's money behind, and then they scramble to come up for a model. So I think that is the main motivation, and it's a lot of people that benefit from it. You know, the actual institution, the researchers themselves. There's actually a pretty huge industry of suppliers. You know, selling the animals, breeding the animals, all the equipment. It's huge.
So research and experimentation itself, not the medication and, you know.
But I'd say both. I mean, the big money is, of course, the pharmaceutical industry. That's just, some unfathomable amount of profit. But it's the same motivation, just bigger pharmaceuticals.
To not use the animals, then wouldn't they make more money because they'd be developing more medications and stuff?
It's, as far as I understand, it's quicker with the animal models, to get it to market. And also it's the law. I mean, there's sort of talk about alternatives and stuff, but it's the law. That's how you do it right now, with pharmaceuticals anyway. And it's quicker because, ethical and good clinical studies with humans are longer and complicated, and humans are expensive, and it's very controllable with a lab animal. I mean, primates are pretty expensive, but still relatively, and the vast majority of animals are rodents, and that's very controllable, not in a way that gives you good science, but that controls expenses and moves things along very fast. It gets things to market faster.
And I guess this should be clarified in terms of the Primate Center. Most of what they're doing there is not toxicology studies to get drugs onto the market. Almost all of the research they're doing is publicly funded basic research. And this is this gee whiz kind of science that is just PhDs writing grant proposals to NIH agencies that are doling out our tax dollars to both clinical and animal research. And they're sort of on the gravy train. I mean, oftentimes the pattern you see is over and over again is a PhD will start his work on some nuance, like, what happens when you inject pregnant monkeys with nicotine. And they'll do it for 25 years. And every time their funding runs out, they'll change up their protocol just slightly. As long as the money is still flowing and they're writing up their papers at the end and getting published, then they're going to keep doing it. And the argument against all that basic research is, we've seen a huge increase in the number of publications that are publishing this work since all this has happened, since '61 or whenever these primate centers were started. And you could make the argument, well, who's looking at this data? You have these publications and you've got all this data being collected, but who's looking at it and where is it going? And I argue that it's collecting dust on shelves and it's not going anywhere, but it's this whole industry perpetuates itself because this money keeps flowing, and as Elaine just said, everyone has their stake in it, whether they're building the cage, breeding the monkey, etc. down the line.
I think that's an important point about basic research, because the Primate Center and other primate centers, they want it both ways. They want to say, oh, well, of course we don't come up with cures every day because it's basic research, aka gee whiz research. We just produce data and hopefully that feeds into the whole scientific community and something comes out of it. But at the same time, they want to justify what they're doing by saying, oh, isn't Alzheimer's terrible and isn't AIDS terrible? So they want it both ways. They want to pull on the heartstrings and justify what they're doing as if they're coming up with, something other than basic research. So that they're working both angles, doing gee whiz research and pretending that they're just trying to cure disease directly, and that we just don't care about that.
And I just want to add one more thing, because I think some of the details of what they're doing is important for people to know. When OHSU tells someone in the public, well, don't you want your loved ones to be able to find a cure for Alzheimer's disease? I mean, here's the Alzheimer's study that I saw when I was there. They had old monkeys, and they had this whole population of old monkeys, and they're like, what are we going to do with all these old monkeys? They called it the aging study, just to see how long you can keep a monkey alive in a cage. And they found out with rhesus macaques a long time. And so they decided to do this Alzheimer's study. So they took these old monkeys and they would put them in a special cage where this shade would come down, and then they had these little this little platform outside, and they would the monkey could reach out when the shade went back up, and there were like 3 little toys, basically little kid toys, and underneath one of the toys was a treat. And the monkeys then would have to remember from time to time where the treat was, and the treat would then be in the spot where it wasn't the last time. And I mean, how in the world is that going to teach us anything about Alzheimer's disease? First of all, these monkeys don't have Alzheimer's. And that's another thing that you need to know when you're talking to people about this research is that these monkeys do not have the same diseases most of the time. They don't have the disease that the human counterpart that they're trying to find some kind of cure for. So they take, cerebral palsy, for example. Monkeys don't get that. So they would inject this horrible, painful cocaine derivative into the feet of these monkeys to cripple them, to try to create something that sort of looked like cerebral palsy in a monkey, and then try to find a cure for it. I mean, how in the world? That's not a naturally occurring disease. You're not studying the same species. I mean, this is the kind of crap research that they're doing at the Primate Center.
Do you have any statistics on how many of these primates? I mean, I understand that they're separate from probably, having rats or whatever, but the primate centers like this, like OHSU has, how many of those are in existence?
There's 8, is that right?
There's 8 national primate research centers. So there's other primate research facilities, including private ones, but for the large national centers, there's 8 of them. Yeah.
It's more worldwide.
Hmm?
More worldwide, just 8 here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we certainly have a lot more than everyone else, but yeah.
I guess I wonder, if you look at the fact that in the U.S. the healthcare system is really poor compared to, say, Canada, and we have a higher infant mortality rate, and we're looking for ways for how we can fund healthcare. That's a big issue in the election this year. If there's any, if you can get through to people with any arguments about how many taxpayer dollars are going to fund the science and what could be done with it instead to actually promote human health in terms of, better care for pregnant mothers and, that's just an example.
Yeah.
But.
That's part of what CAT has tried to do with our, White Coat Welfare campaign, is really parallel the decline in human services and, medical care in particular with the increase in funding for bogus animal research. So we have done that. That point needs to be made more. Yeah, and we did a project a little while ago where we interviewed people. I didn't talk much about Judy Cameron, but she's kind of a favorite because her research is so on its face value, just absurd. And one of the things she's studying is whether infants who, and this is the wording from her grant abstract, whether infants who receive greater social support are less likely to develop anxious and depressive behaviors than infants who receive more social support. Did I say that right? So this is her words, and she's modeling this in monkeys to see if infants who get more social support are less likely to be anxious and depressive. So what we did, and I'm a social service worker and I work with kids, and so are a number of people in our organization, coincidentally. So we went around with this grant abstract and we interviewed like teachers and social workers and psychologists who specialize in working with the people that supposedly Judy Cameron's data will extrapolate to. And it was great. We just read it and people would be like, you're kidding. Like, it was just, because, so that was kind of fun in a dark way. So especially like to talk about Judy Cameron because it's such an obvious waste, and just tie it into the kind of question about animal research in general. Yeah, she also is studying, she's unbelievable. She's studying whether exercise is good for the brain.
Is she a mother?
I don't know.
She is.
She is.
Yeah, she's.
Doesn't she have cats? Or well, they all do.
She has a daughter.
Yeah, that was some of the responses we got were like, just ask anyone who knows a child, just ask any social service worker. And the psychologists we talked to were like, oh my God. And they're pulling out like scans of brains of like, oh, here's the child that had less social support and here's their brain and here's the like tomes of research that's already been done on this in people. Yeah, there was a great article in the Oregonian, it might have been over a year ago now. It was about this breakthrough from one of her studies that showed that orphaned babies who receive a surrogate parent do better. So what she did is she deliberately, it's like the same maternal deprivation crap that was going on in the 50s. orphan baby monkeys and then give some of them a surrogate parent and some of them not. And it turns out the ones with the surrogate parent did better. So that was in the Oregonian, and she was like, this might be important because it might apply to humans who are orphaned. And at the same time, the DHS budget is cut. We're talking foster care, like, is foster care better than being orphaned? And I work with the people who work in foster care, and they've all got like so many clients they can't do a good job. There's not enough homes. I mean, it's like the situation is terrible.
No, I know.
And so I'm sorry, you get my point, but we try to make that point for sure. It's a good one. Yeah.
When doing outreach, a lot of people always bring up the fact that OHSU has some like low-income programs since the economy is the way it is. What could we tell them about, like, say, they bring up the dentistry program? I think there's some like cancer programs, and they offer like affordable health care. Since they are linked with the Primate Research Center, it's always hard to kind of reach them because they're adamant about going to these low-income places. Is there anything besides prevention, like having a vegan diet, riding your bike? Like, what are other things we can tell these people?
You mean to encourage them not to go to an OHSU clinic?
Yeah.
Personally, I wouldn't encourage someone to not go to OHSU if they really didn't have another viable choice. It's even in our literature. It's like, if you have a choice, boycott OHSU. But if that's the only place someone can go, I'm not going to try and encourage them not to, personally. Although, yeah, obviously prevention is better than going to do a doctor because you're now sick. But I wouldn't, because I don't think. I mean, I think it's valid to try to boycott OHSU as best you can. But I also think it's a huge institution that does some good things. So that's how I would always word it, if you have another choice. But a lot of people maybe don't. For one, because of financial, maybe that's the only clinic that will see them with no money. Or maybe they need some kind of advanced treatment that they can't get anywhere else, which also happens. So that's my personal response to that.
The only thing that I would add to that is, going to OHSU or even working at OHSU does not preclude you from speaking out against the primate research and the flawed animal research there. I mean, there's a difference, and we don't have to, we can accept the good things OHSU does in the community. That's great. We give them kudos for those things. That's fine. That's great. Let's get rid of this animal research so that we can spend more resources on those good things and not waste money on, and I talk to, sometimes, I'll have OHSU employees come up to me after I've spoken, or they'll meet me and, they'll be like, oh, I feel bad about working at OHSU, or, I'm really torn about this issue. Well, great, give us information about what's happening inside, what they're saying, and do what you can from the inside of OHSU to talk amongst your coworkers. So I think meeting anyone from OHSU is always an opportunity to network and not an opportunity to make someone feel bad about working there, because OHSU is the largest employer in Portland, or second largest. They're huge, and a lot of people work there, and a lot of the people that work there, I know what OHSU tells their employees about the Primate Center. Those people don't even know the truth, so you can't blame them for working there. We don't know of any private tobacco funding, although it's more difficult to find out those things. The public information only applies to publicly funded research. It would certainly be in the interest of a tobacco company to fund research like that, and they've done a lot of it.
I'm also wondering what the scientists doing those studies claim to be trying to research with that.
Well, Elliot Spindell, and I mentioned this when Elaine first started talking, what breakthroughs. Elliot Spindell claims that he's made a breakthrough in recognizing in monkeys what was long established in human beings before he discovered it in monkeys, that massive doses of vitamin C does tend to mitigate some of the effects, some of the negative effects on the fetus growing in the womb of someone who's smoking. So, and I guess, you know, he could be looking for a cure so that women can keep smoking during pregnancy, you know, which is totally ridiculous. You know, we know smoking is harmful. It's, you know, all that money would be better spent in trying to help women who are struggling with smoking when they're pregnant.
Well, and the thing is that I'm a former nurse, and vitamin C is water soluble, so there would be absolutely no harm in testing that on pregnant women,
right,
instead of on monkeys.
Right.
And we know that smoking depletes vitamin C, so it's like kind of a no-brainer. But
yeah, and we also know that there's a correlation between money invested in smoking cessation education and people stop smoking. I mean, the data is out there, and in fact, in Oregon, about the same time when, this is another huge irony of all this, our OHSU succeeded in extracting $200 million of our tobacco settlement money from our state legislature after they had asked for it in a much smaller scale to the Oregon voters, and we said no.
10 million.
For 10 million. They went to the legislature and asked our representatives for 200 million, and they got it. So about this same time, when they're getting all this tobacco settlement money, which was earmarked originally, all that tobacco settlement from these huge class action lawsuits because the tobacco companies couldn't defend with their animal research anymore. They couldn't defend that smoking wasn't harmful. They had to pay billions of dollars. It was supposed to go towards smoking cessation education. And here in Oregon, $200 million of it went to OHSU to further their basic research. At the same time when our state budgets for smoking cessation were cut and smoking among teens went up as a result. So there's just a direct correlation. If you put more money into educating people about stop smoking, less people smoke. So we know it works.
just coincidentally, that was the same year that the Oregon Department of Human Services budget got cut like $207 million. And they handed over $200 million to OHSU, and they had almost complete discretion on what they did with that money. So they could have put it, same year that the Oregon health plan standard went away totally. So yeah, it's really outrageous.
I have a question. So it sounds like of the 8 national primate centers, the one here focuses mostly on basic research. Do other ones focus on toxicology stuff, like pharmaceutical, or is that all kind of independently funded, like groups or companies, like HLS and stuff like that?
I think OHSU is trying to get more into some of the product testing and developing drugs because there's so much profit in it. Mm-hmm. But all the 8 primate centers are all geared and have been doing basic research for the most part, with some exceptions. So yeah, a lot of the toxicology stuff is private labs.
So would it make sense to go to do something toward the NIH, or like what, is that what you were talking about when you're talking about legal approaches? Or, I mean, how does the funding, I mean, this is all political, I guess, how does the funding for the NIH get determined, and then how does that get channeled out to these 8 centers? Mm-hmm. I was wondering if the money dries up, you know, nobody's going to be, you know, asking local people to fund these.
Right.
You know,
It's a great point, and I mean we've in our vivisection calls, anti-vivisection calls lately at IDA, we've been talking about that exact thing, linking to the fact, and I don't want to go into a whole lot of detail because we're just beginning some talks about this, but you know, the fact that our economy is tanking, you know, and it's tanking because our we've basically gutted all the regulation, and it was, you know, a free-for-all on Wall Street. You can make the exact same case about the regulation of these research labs. It's the fox watching the hen house. There's no regulation here, and that's really connected to how bad things are for the animals and for human health as a result. But we tried years ago to get the General Accounting Office to do an audit of the NIH funding for animal research, and it was one of those very slow-moving things that I think the person that we had the ear of in Congress went over to the dark side. He actually became a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical industry in the midst of the investigation. And so, but that's, you know, that's the type of thing that could be very useful if there could be a really hard-hitting audit of the money at NIH, and that would be the General Accounting Office that would be responsible for doing that, and just looking at the money and seeing if this is a good use of funds. Especially now with the way things are with government funding, and the presidential candidates keep getting asked, well, where are you going to cut? What are you going to do?
Yeah.
This is a great place to start.
And then at the same time, doesn't it kind of like if the NIH requires drug companies requires them to test on animals? Is that right?
Yeah, in the preclinical trials, for the most part, animal tests are mandated, not in every single case, but.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what happens, because as I was saying, that in a way animal tests are more expensive, but some of the new technology, like, you know, like what we're seeing very recently, does have the potential to be cheaper and faster for toxicology screening and such. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays in. If the government continues to sort of bankrupt itself, will they actually do the sensible thing and go with something that not only works better, but that is faster and cheaper? And I really don't know, because decisions aren't being made based on what makes sense, but they might be forced into it. I don't know.
I mean, one telling sign, you don't really hear a lot of detail from the government about the changes that they're making, but there was a USA Today headline that basically read something like animal tests to end, or something. I can't remember. Do you remember the exact headline?
It's something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was.
But there were three government agencies in the U.S. that were commenting that that they were looking to end animal tests in toxicology studies. And this is, the handwriting is on the wall, I think, that they see that, you know, the better alternatives are already there, and they're going to need to implement them. It just, you know, it might take them a decade to do it, and we need to pressure them to do it sooner than that.
I just wanted to plug something if possible. You were just discussing grassroots, and along with the great work the Coalition of Abolish Animal Testing and the Defense of Animals does. There's a table for the Animal Defense League in the back, and it's a collective organization of individuals, and all the discussions have just started, and fall time campaigns are including the Oregon National Primate Research Center. So the next meeting where it will be discussed is this upcoming Thursday at 7 p.m. There's a list, I think, back there to sign up. So.
I was wondering if just watching that movie, I just kind of got the feeling that the biology of the animals in captivity, they're being examined. The biology is probably quite different from our biology when we're out here. I'm wondering if that would have enough of an impact on you know, the tests and stuff to pretty much nullify them. I mean, is there something to be said for that?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that they say to justify using monkeys is that they can control all the factors and the stressors. Well, that's what Judy Cameron talks about, is controlling the stressors, which you can't do in humans, and there's some truth to that. But that admits the fact that stressors and whatnot affect the data. So yeah, that is a problem. It affects your body, what's going on in your environment, of course. So that's absolutely true.
And in terms of, you know, their claims of having a controlled environment, they're totally ridiculous claims. I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. I mean, the amount of stress that any individual monkey in any individual protocol or research project endures is based on so many unpredictable things. Like, one of the most obvious ones is that they have this two-tiered caging system. As any arboreal monkey, or a monkey that would flee into a tree to escape their predators, rhesus macaques feel more comfortable up higher. Their predators are the humans who enter the room that might pull them out of the cage, wrestle them out for surgery or procedure or injection. And so you've got these monkeys down below that can never get away or climb up higher, that are always under more stress, and it's been studied. I mean, they study all this stuff, and they know that they're causing these variables and that the monkeys below are more stressed out. The monkeys in the bottom cages in many facilities are getting up to 70% less light than the monkeys in the top cages. And they're getting moved around, you know, and like when a researcher is picking monkeys, they're picking monkeys off of a piece of paper. They don't know where they live or if they're in a top or bottom cage. They don't pay attention to those details. Monkeys are getting moved around all the time. They do have some, because they're very social, they have relationships, even though they're individually caged with the monkeys around them, and can be very intimidated by a subordinate monkey, can be very intimidated by another monkey. I mean, it's as if you're trying to get, you know, data from monkeys who are in the equivalent of Auschwitz, you know, or you know, some other horrible place, and expect that that is going to extrapolate even to another monkey, you know, in a wild population. They, you know, as we all know, blood cortisol levels change when you get stressed out, and it affects our physiology. And so, yeah, these, I mean, you can make the arguments on many levels. Elaine kind of mapped out just the basic argument that you can extrapolate, but if you get beyond that, or if you believe that some useful data could come out of it, then you've got all these other factors to look at too. Even, they've done studies, even mice who, you know, you could argue have the you know, least, it's, you know, some people might argue that you can meet a mouse's needs maybe better in a laboratory setting than you could meet a higher primate. But even their own research shows that these mice are incredibly stressed out from their environs too, being in laboratories. So it's definitely a factor.
Kind of touching on that, and I know it's a little off topic, but I think it's important, just to really basically, do you guys have any information on what other animals and what quantity are being researched at OHSU besides primates?
I can give a sort of answer.
Okay.
Because we don't really know the number of animals, and you might have more information, but, well, as far as the kind of animals, it's like all over the place, but maybe you can answer that a little better. But
okay.
As far as numbers, we don't know, and that's because by law they don't have to count the mice and rats, and that's the majority of animals used in research, you know, all over, and specifically at OHSU, because under the law they're not covered by the Animal Welfare Act. They're not animals. So, but what we do know is that the primates, which is about 4,200 now, and all non-rodent species, which would be like dogs, cats, cattle, I guess they've had, all sorts of whatever non-rodent species, and is less than 5% of the animals they have. So if you got 4,200 monkeys, however many assorted non-rodent species, less than 5%. So I can't give you a figure, but it gives you some idea of the scale. So maybe you can talk about what specific species, because you were that you saw.
Gerbils, guinea pigs, mice and rats, fish, frogs, rabbits, sheep, cows. Did I say dogs and cats? Dogs and cats. And those are the only ones I can think of right off the top. The Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine has a very successful and active campaign against the live animal labs that you're talking about, doing, having medical students using animals to practice on. The top 10 medical schools, and almost all the medical schools now, do not use live animal labs anymore. That's a very winnable one. That's definitely, we are going to succeed in the short term on that one. And PCRM is working. In fact, they have a campaign against OHSU in their live pig lab.
Yeah, I think that there's something like 150 medical schools, and there's something like 10 that still do live animal labs. So it's almost gone. Not quite yet, but yeah, it's one of the very successful campaigns that have happened.
Well, it's encouraging because I think doing this can be kind of a burnout thing, but you can see some victories.
Yeah.
Encouraging.
Right, so we're out of time, Chad?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have a little more time, but if people want to hear from these folks or a DVD or get on the email list.
Yeah, we'd encourage you to sign up. And I just want to say real quick, In Defense of Animals just got a new office in Portland, and we're having this week is World Go Vegan Week, and so we're having an outreach event at last Thursday. Our new office is at 18th in Alberta, Northeast Alberta, and we're having a mailing party starting that afternoon. So this upcoming Thursday, if anyone wants to join us, we're sending out postcards for Fur Free Friday, and then we're going to have a vegan outreach that night at last Thursday at 18th in Alberta. And stay tuned for more events around this primate research issue, and thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.